Hello everybody. My name is Ellis Calvillo. I'm actually a district manager here at Keystone Pacific. Along with overseeing a team of managers, I'm also responsible for the community management education, which also involves board member education. I'll be moderating the Q&A portion of our program today, in addition to the technical aspect of the Zoom calls. So as I said, I'll be the one muting all of you if you try to unmute yourself here in the middle of the presentation. At this time, I do ask that you please keep your microphones muted to minimize the background noise. As a matter of housekeeping, we will be asking the attendees to hold their questions to the end of the program. So let me introduce one of our other moderators here. This is Teresa Duho, who is a regional manager at Keystone. Teresa will be moderating the questions to our panel.
Thank you very much, Ellis. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this important webinar this evening. I'd like to introduce you to our panel of experts. We have a combo, actually. Fred Whitney and Dirk Petchel founded Whitney and Petchel. Together, they have more than 50 years of experience. Whoa, so sorry. Over 50 years of experience in the association industry. Whitney and Petchel presently serves as counsel for hundreds of homeowner associations ranging from some of the largest master plan communities in California to communities with as few as 6 to 10 doors. Fred and Dirk are both frequent speakers and educators with significant involvement in the California legislative process pertaining to community associations. Next, we have our own Jamie Chandler. Jamie is Senior Vice President of Community Management for Keystone, and over the last 16 years has gained a depth of experience in managing the operations and complicated elements of homeowner associations. Jamie is a magna cum laude graduate from the University of California, Riverside, with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and emphasis on administrative studies. Jamie also holds a Professional Community Association Manager designation. And last but not least, we have Robert DiNiccolo. Robert DiNiccolo is a partner at the firm of Richardson, Ober, and DiNiccolo and represents community associations across the state of California. He is a fellow of the College of Community Association Lawyers, serves on the board of directors of the CAI, Orange County chapter of CAI, and is a longtime member of CAI's California Legislative Action Committee. So right now, we'd like to get into the actual discussion. I'd like to thank our panel for joining us tonight to provide us guidance on how to reopen facilities within community associations. As you all know, there have been a lot of rhetoric surrounding community amenities, which is why today's topic is vital to reopening facilities responsibly. So our first question, I guess I'll go in order with Fred, Dirk, and Robert. This is to our panel. Reopening recreational facilities can be a newsworthy event within our state, especially when the state and local agencies' guidance and enforcement shifts daily. Fred, can you provide us guidance on how boards can effectively manage the reopening of facilities while also balancing the risk associated with an evolving pandemic?
I can sure try. So let's kind of start with this. And we're trying, all of us as panelists here, to leave time open in the end. So if I'm going a little bit quick, then just kind of make a little side note, and then we'll kind of pick that up at the end. So I'd like to just begin with this, and I think that we've all felt this a bit, is when COVID hit us, it was really startling, right? It's the kind of thing that none of us in the past century have experienced. And so the immediate reaction, from county level, state level, Disneyland for the first time in living memory just closed. And as hard as that was, at least, we were all doing it. And then we were just kind of hunkering down to see what happens next day by day. As things are starting to reopen now, it's actually become a little bit harder, right? Because we're all trying to figure out, without a real roadmap, how we're going to move forward with it here. And so this is what I kind of wanted to provide, is a structure or a framework that you can carry back with you to your boards to figure out how you're going to open these things up. And so first, I'd like to take the tack of saying, first, what are the risks of opening? Because when we're figuring out how we're going to open, what we're really saying is, how can we open and mitigate against the concerns that we have pressing on us from all sides? And so I think really looking at the risks that we have, there are three. One is this: we might get shut down, right? If you open up your facilities, you might just find, if there's member complaints or something like that happening, you might find law enforcement coming in to either shut you down or maybe second, to fine you if something's happening. Now, I'm not seeing a lot of that. And I actually think that's probably the lower risk right now. I think if facilities are going to be shut down, and we talk about it a little more in a second, I think they're going to be shut down because they're really not effectively controlling the social distancing in place. So if we put some plans in place, I can help with that. The third risk, and probably the biggest risk, to be honest, is the risk of getting sued. It's going to be likely, there are going to be some associations at least that are going to face claims where they're getting sued. Not necessarily just for catching the disease, right, which is bad enough, but we've all had flus, we've all had to get through health concerns here. The real claims to fear are the ones where it's going to be a wrongful death, right, where somebody came to the facility and it resulted in them passing away, or they carried the virus back to their household, right, and they did that. And so it begs the question, what can we do to mitigate those risks? Right now, the first is this: we can control the crowds that are coming into the area. Because if we don't let our facilities get overcrowded, it's far less likely that we're going to see someone in law enforcement coming in to shut us down. The second thing, we talk about this a lot in here, is we should have signage, right? We need to start thinking about having signage, first, that warns of the risk of disease, right? And that this is a serious and even life-threatening disease, and that while the association is taking precautions, there's nothing the association can do to eliminate the disease. So if you come and use these facilities, then the users need to understand they're using it at their own risk. Okay, the second, and we see this a lot in the information that's developing right now, you're probably going to see in facilities a lot of signage that helps with basic hygiene and things. Like, we're probably gonna have signs in the bathroom that say, wash your hands for 20 seconds and dry. And you might see other signs about whatever is being required right now, whether it's masks or other things there. The good news is, because we've been in the dark for several weeks here now, but starting really, a couple of weeks ago, we started getting some guidance from the governor at the state level, especially when stage 2 opened. There's some information regarding the businesses that are still closed that you can look to. And they talk about things like public pools and playgrounds in that area. So we can look to that a bit. Virtually all of the counties down here, at least in Southern California, have taken that order from the governor and republished it in one way or another. I know that San Bernardino, Orange County, LA County have all parroted that exact language and put together their own handouts that have it. So that's some guidance we're being provided as to when we may open things, but more specifically here to kind of the first phase, because I think behind the scenes at the beginning, we're all going to be working on what's it going to look like, right, when we open our pools. And there is some guidance, like the CDC has come down with some basic plans that apply for when pools reopen. And some of the counties are providing that as well. I know Riverside has some information. Orange County has some information. And when you look at those, I think it's important to note this, because members are going to come after you and they're going to say, the CDC and the Orange County Health or whatever county that you're in has said, you can open pools now. That's not what they're saying. They're not speaking as to when you open pools. They're saying what you have to do when the pools open. All right, and so we're able to pull now some guidance from them. And most of them here are speaking in terms of, you have to develop a written plan for how your facility is going to open and how it's going to be maintained and managed while it's there. And so I've been encouraging as something of a structure for you guys to discuss this and come up with it. Sort of a three-phase plan. Starts with you guys assessing the relative risks of your common areas, right? And I think you can assess your facilities as either low, medium, or high risk based on a few factors that if you distill down the CDC, you're basically looking to: one, are there contained air spaces in your facilities? Two, what are the areas within the facility that have heightened physical contact? Because we need to have a disinfection plan in place to control those touchable surfaces and physical contact. And as we're going through this, we need to understand that we're not just making plans for the membership. We need to take into consideration how members are going to use the facilities, but we also need to figure out how staff and even vendors are going to play into that, because we have a role in making sure that everybody's taking reasonable precautions to remain safe. All right, and so what can we do in the mitigation plans as we're going through these resources to sort of address what the concerns are? One, signage, right? We're going to have tons of that. Next is, I think that associations need to think in terms of phasing their facilities in, right? And some of the lower risk facilities, like maybe your walking trails, your parks, your open greenbelt areas, those really can start opening now. The county is opening those, cities are opening those. So we have a lot of models to follow that are allowing us to handle that. The other things that we're going to do is, we might be limiting the hours of facilities, or we'll limit the capacity. Like when pools ultimately open, I envision we might be opening at a 25 or a 50% capacity in the beginning, until people kind of learn the rules, right? Learn how to socialize themselves a bit, to keep each other safe and to be respectful of one another. And so you're going to see some things in your facilities that you're doing, like you might be considering adding hand sanitizer stations to places, or virtually all of the government bodies that have provided us with some guidance, like in health and the CDC, they require that we make sure that our bathrooms are maintained where they have soap and paper towels. A lot of the decisions we're going to have to make as associations is, how are we going to find the resources, and how much resource can we put into a pool, right? Because if you have a highly trafficked pool, you might be looking for ways to bring in janitorial staff that's going to remain staffing the facility throughout the entire time that it's used. I think for a lot of associations, they're going to have to come up with some plans that might introduce some ideas for like self-regulation, where members are taking a more active role in promoting their own safety. With some mid-risk facilities, for example, like say tennis courts. A lot of cities now have opened tennis courts. The county has some guidance as to tennis courts being available for play, but we're not just turning the key and opening the door. What we're doing is we're setting some rules in place for such that it's like singles play, and where you pass on the right-hand side of the court and you bring a disinfectant wipey to hit the handle, right? When you're bringing your members are coming to or from going to the facilities. I think when pools open, and we should be planning for that now, even if you're not opening yet, we should be putting the plans in place for it. We have to think about things like, where are we going to stage the furnishings, right? Because we should be staging the furnishings in a manner that promotes social distancing. And I've been promoting rules where like members can't move the furniture into different places. They need to respect that. The CDC even has and some of the rules, while they're all recommendations, right? They're not mandating it. Some of the rules are suggesting things like we should quarantine infected furniture, like they do at the supermarket with carts, and that they all wipe down before they come in. So for your facilities, you might actually think about things like removing some of the furniture, or maybe even all of the furniture. Right? If you've got a smaller facility and you're not going to have the resource to do this maintenance, you may be looking at a facility where all the furnishings are removed and the homeowners are bringing their own chairs in, right? So it's one less thing for them to wipe down and disinfect. Right, and again, we're going to be writing down these plans. We're going to be noting who's responsible for doing the sanitation things and the schedule that they're coming in for. All right, so this is sort of the planning in the background that takes place, and that's going to pull us forward into how you're going to communicate that. And so, Dirk.
Thank you so much, Fred. Dirk, what are your thoughts on how boards can effectively manage communications to members, especially with particularly polarizing viewpoints?
This is, in 20-something years of representing only community associations, I've never seen a time that's more tumultuous than right now. So I think one of the most important aspects of how we're dealing with this reopening process is how we're managing relationships. And that starts with relationships with both the board members amongst themselves, as well as the board's relationship with the members within the community. And we've seen a lot of illustrations over that over the last few weeks. I've been on many dozens of Zoom phone calls where I click in to see a board of directors with two directors spitting nickels at each other because one of them, and I'll exaggerate of course, one wants to open the pool in 10 minutes and the other one doesn't want to open it till fall of 2024. And they are going at each other, and it's dividing boards. It's making very difficult to get business done by boards of any type, including this. With the membership, we are seeing uprisings, literally, in various areas. And I jokingly say all of them, the most extreme always seem to be Huntington Beach. And I haven't quite figured that out, but the worst are there, but they're all over Southern California, and many dozens of associations, from reactions that we've literally had assaults upon on-site staff with threats that if they don't open the common area, that they will be physically harmed. We have groups of homeowners that are telling the board, if you don't have that pool open tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., we are going to blow, literally these are the terms, we are going to blow down that door and we're occupying the pool as if we're on Wall Street now. And more and more often we're seeing the beginning of petitions for removal of the board, recall of the board, and things of that sort. So we're really seeing a huge stress on the relationships between the different parties to this whole thing. And that's making it even more difficult to address what we really need to address right now. So I'm going to concentrate on the relationships for a moment. First of all, between board members, there's one simple thing all of you as board members need to know is it doesn't make any sense to talk about when you are going to open a particular facility, particularly a pool, until you have your plan already in place. So I don't care if one director wants it open tomorrow morning and another wants it open in fall of 2024. The first discussion is, what are the procedures that we all agree upon? And what are the rules we want to put in place, which I'll get to that process in a moment. And then once we have all of those things determined, then the next thing on the table is to talk about what an appropriate date is. This got very hot right up until last week when the governor announced the terms of phase 2, which gave a little bit of clarity and at least told us that most of the counties are interpreting that as the pools aren't ready to open yet. Pools are the hottest epicenter at this very moment because of the warm weather and Memorial Day. So I think that's really important for boards of directors to do that, because what happens is no matter which side of that equation you're on, and I know I'm talking to a lot of you right now, you start to see, both sides will understand those logistics, and those are very important. We have a lot of associations that don't have on-site staff. How are we going to deal with that? Are we going to, and that is what we have to deal with, and what are our rules going to look like? So with the membership, largely the same thing, but I know that all of you, if some of you have been on the board a long time, you always hear every year when there's, maybe not every year, but periodically, that the membership is saying, you don't communicate with us enough. You're doing this in secret. You're not showing us this. And I know sometimes it's not actually true. We've had associations that would put the new color palette for the building on the corner of the entrance for 3 months in a row, trying to get people to stop and comment on it. But then the day that first brush hits the wall, the whole place goes nuts because you didn't tell them, right? I get that. But it's a common complaint. It's a common belief. Sometimes it's true. And I think no time has been more important to regularly communicate with the association what you're doing than right now. You don't want a recall petition in the middle of this. We're dealing with some already, and you don't want the irrational uprising. You want to bring everybody's angst level from about 95 down to at least 50 or 60. At least let them know what you're doing. So regular communications to the membership that we are working on our protocols. We are actively working with professional management and legal counsel to figure out, what the appropriate time is to open, as well as what our proper protocol to best comply and best reduce the potential liability for the association is. And if we're regularly communicating that, we've had a lot of success in at least calming that down some. Not going to say they're going to be happy with you, but at least they'll know that you're doing something and not just ignoring the pool that they pay their dollars for, which is what we hear about every day. So I think that has been an effective strategy. I think it's very meaningful. So the way that Fred had explained some of the initial evaluations, how do we roll this out? Well, as I said, we're going to there's some very difficult questions, and some of these are liability-based questions. They're not discussions that we necessarily want to have in front of the membership from the beginning, and we're entitled to have liability-based discussions in executive session. So I think this all begins in an executive session, where the board with professional management and possibly legal counsel begins to evaluate the plan and how do we limit our risk while we still open this. Are we going to have sanitation stations? Are we going to use our existing employees to man certain things in different ways? Are we going to use our patrol to maybe go by and deal with part of this? Or are we going to, for some period of time, hire an employee or an on-site vendor that we've never had before and we've never budgeted for? These are tough discussions. So I think initially the discussion is in executive session on those types of issues. Another thing to do in the executive session is to evaluate that level of risk. The passive parks, low risk. The tot lot, very high risk. Number one, you have kids. Second, they don't understand social distancing. And it would be very hard to sanitize some of those crazy things they climb on out there. So that may be an element of the park that we need to talk about, and maybe that stays cordoned off. And how are we going to cordon it off? Discussions of that type. And the next is, how are we going to enforce anything? Are we going to rely entirely on self-policing? We do now to a certain extent. We've been laughing here that because we've been confronted with that, we can't allow self-policing, but every one of you that has a pool probably has a sign on the door that says, don't come in here if you have diarrhea. I don't think anybody's checking. Is that equivalent of the COVID? I'm not sure. That's a discussion we have to have. But I think through all of this, we need to take an understanding approach, because a lot of our members are very wound up right now. And we've already had some altercations between patrol and some people who are in areas they weren't supposed to be in that are very unfortunate that we're having to deal with. I think there, in a sense, needs to be post orders from anybody doing any enforcement of, what are you going to do? Are you going to force these people to separate? Are you going to force them out of the facility? Or are you going to back off and just inform them, look, we want you to do more social spacing here so that we don't have to make a tough decision in another few days or another few weeks through the board of directors that we need to close this down because it's out of control. So I think a little bit softer approach to enforcement might be the way to start out, and then we would adjust if there are problems with that. The other issue is just the control of crowds. I mean, how are we going to evaluate that? Who's going to be reporting back? And at what point are we going to call that emergency or special board meeting to address this and maybe adjust some of our rules because of issues that we've seen? So I think those are all executive session type discussions, and a nice outline of those going in so that they could all be resolved. But going back to the communication with the membership, the next step I think is really important. And you're going to hear from a lot of people that, these rules can be adopted as emergency rules. Going back to the basics of rule adoption within your association, you typically publish them 28 days in advance with the actual rule and then a notice of the purpose and intent of the rule. And then you hear the membership comments, and then at that meeting you can adopt those rules as the ordinary course. The Civil Code also provides for emergency rules. If we don't have time to do that and we need to put rules in place for life safety issues, the Civil Code does provide for that without that 28-day notice. And there's times we use that. But in this case, I think even if it's shorter than 28 days and we need to do them quickly, because we can. If this isn't life safety, I don't know what is. But we may want to give notice of those rules. We may want to have that open session with a very open dialogue with our members so that they can come, comment on it, tell us what they like about them and not like about it. Why? Because A, it'll be interesting to hear that. Maybe there will actually would be some adjustments to it. But just as importantly, to let them, the membership, who, by the way, remember, you have that center group that probably is just quietly sitting there. Maybe they're frustrated, maybe they understand, but it's the 10% on either end that want it not to open for a long time or open right away. Both of those sides are going to see that there's been a reasoned approach and be a part of that approach. And we're going to ask them to participate in that approach here and on the self-policing later. So that brings it closer to the membership and brings everybody together a little bit more. So that's how we envision that going into an open session where we're talking about these things. Now, the mechanics of emergency rules, just to switch back to that, no formal notice is required. As I just said, we recommend it. Maybe if we have some time now, if we are actually putting these together, maybe we can adopt them on the 28-day cycle and really vet them quite a bit. But in any case, we need to be prepared to change them. The interesting thing about an emergency rule is it's only good for 120 days, and then it can't be readopted. So if you do impose an emergency rule for all of the things that we're doing to open our facilities, we need to be ready, and we need to calendar dates that about 60 days down the line to evaluate how things are working. If they're working fine, great, leave them the same and let's get them into that 28-day process and get them adopted as permanent rules. Or do we want to modify them a little bit? Did the situations change? Have we seen some particular problems? Do we want to adjust them somewhat? And so either way, with an emergency rule, you're going to do something at 60 days. If you had the time up front to do them with a fully noticed adoption, you may not have to take any further action if there's no adjustments we need to be made. But right now, more than any time, communication with the membership is very, very important on a step-by-step basis. You're going to bring those two sides of the equation together closer if they're a part of the process. And between the board, the most important thing you can do for your association right now is very thoughtfully, and with a generous use of your time at this point, is really go through what the procedures are as compared to what you can compare it to. Orange County's given us some nice groundwork for the pools. Some of them are going to be difficult to deal with, and we're going to have to struggle with how we best comply with them. Or Riverside County also has some nice criteria. But some thoughtful, generous work of the board right now to sit down and talk that through and get those to be nice, clean, and concise. And only then do we start talking about dates of opening these facilities. So that's my thoughts on that subject.
Thank you so much, Dirk. I appreciate that. Robert, what would you like to add in relation to creating an effective plan?
Well, thanks, Teresa. So there's quite a bit, I think, actually, we can touch on both what Fred and Dirk said, actually. And I think the way I've been approaching it and the way I've been advising my clients is you have to take a look at basically a three-pronged question. Is can you open, should you open, and and how do you open? And if you start with that structure, it kind of gives you a path to follow through that process. So can you open? I think we're all in agreement technically. I think the state, and if you go look at the state's website, stage 2 says community pools are not supposed to be open. But the question is, who's going to enforce that? Most counties are saying they're closed. Riverside has said you can open them if you want. City of Palm Springs has some good guidelines as well. So you need to check at your city, county, and state. The state is going to essentially defer to the local counties. And in fact, the governor today in his press conference said there's going to be an easing in the process by which counties can attest that they're ready to move into the next stage. So where you are in that process is really going to depend on what the county says. And the county is going to be the one that's going to enforce it. I mean, Fred mentioned about enforcement and what's going to happen. It's going to be the county. The state's not coming down and dealing with this. The state has all kinds of other issues it has to deal with. So now with Orange County as an example, I know this is true in other counties. LA County, San Bernardino, San Diego have said HOA pools are closed. LA actually came out with a new order just last week that specifically referenced HOA pools. Irvine was discussing it last week, and in the city council meeting, the city of Irvine had a discussion where the city attorney said that he talked to the state public health department and said pools are not essential, and so the city of Irvine said we're going to keep them closed. And that specific discussion was around HOA pools. So the question is, can you? Probably no, the state wants them closed. Are you going to face enforcement? That you need to check with your county and city, because like I said, there are some cities that also have specific rules and guidances. So look at that in terms of can you, then should you, is really a difficult question, because you have to look at, okay, you have to kind of combine that with how. Fred mentioned, for example, are you going to have time slots, and are you going to increase your janitorial staff and cleaning requirements? Look at the guidance for your specific area, both the city, if you have one, and the county. Some of them have very specific plans. The county of San Diego, for example, has a disinfection plan that you have to fill out and submit. And when you're creating disinfection plans, that's an excellent place to start, because we don't have to recreate the wheel. We have a document from a public health agency that tells us, hey, what can we look at in terms of public health? I keep telling people, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a public health specialist. I can only tell you the risks and liabilities. Let's go look at what the public health officials have said. So I would recommend you start off by looking at the county, your county. If your county does not have a disinfection plan, go pull the one from San Diego County. Just because it's from another county doesn't mean you can't use it and adopt it for use in your community. And that talks about identifying the high touch surface areas, gate handles, bathroom door handles, furniture, and it talks about also addressing the cleaning of the bathrooms, the facilities. Fred mentioned you may have to remove some of the pool furniture. And how do you deal with that? And do you require disinfecting in between guests? And that goes to some of the rules, is do you have to have rules where you say you're responsible for cleaning and disinfecting? I would stay away from sanitizing. Sanitizing has a whole connotation that eliminates the risk, and I don't think we want to get into that, but cleaning and disinfecting, at least I think I'm comfortable with. You're responsible for cleaning and disinfecting the furniture and anything you touch while you're at the pool. Also, I'm going to be honest with you, great artists copy, good artists copy, great artists steal. I saw an article that Disney is posting signage when it reopens, and I love the language, and I think we can steal it. And I think in terms of signage to put up, you can add to whatever else you put up, and this is what it says. An inherent risk of exposure to COVID-19 exists in any public place where people are present. COVID-19 is an extremely contagious disease that can lead to severe illness and death. By entering and using the community facilities, you voluntarily assume all risks related to exposure to COVID-19. I'll use Disney Council's language any day of the week. I think that's good language to add to our signage and our rules. The risk of getting sued is certainly there, but keep in mind that somebody's going to have to prove that they got COVID-19 from using your facility. That's going to be difficult, I think, to really establish that that is the source of the exposure. But the bigger problem is whether they can prove it or not. You have to check with your insurance agents, because many policies have an exclusion for infectious disease or claims arising out of infectious disease. So you need to make sure when you're evaluating whether should we, in that should we stage, do we have insurance coverage if we get a claim? If somebody sues us for exposure to COVID-19, whether they can prove it or not, are we going to have insurance coverage? Because even if you can win the case, you're going to have to come up with the defense fees and defense costs until you win the case. So check with your insurance broker to see if you have insurance coverage for infectious disease. Once you get, okay, we have insurance coverage, we have a plan. Now, I think was Dirk mentioned about having that discussion about liability and then moving it into open session. I actually think right now we're in the phase where you should start communicating with the members. We are looking at opening. We may not open tomorrow, but here is what we are looking at opening, and have the discussion in open session of we need to increase janitorial. Janitorial needs to come every day. Maybe they have to come twice a day if you have a high use facility. We have to look at amending the pool rules to limit access to certain times of the day and provide opportunities for the janitorial staff to clean. We can only have so many people in the pool area. Oh, and we may need to have a pool monitor there to keep track of how many people come in. Those are going to be expenses, and your community should know, as they're sitting there demanding, and we're going to see more and more of this, communities demanding the reopening of the pools, that the board is not just sitting there keeping it closed for no reason. You are evaluating, do we have insurance coverage? What is the cost of the additional janitorial expenses? Do we need to have a pool monitor? What's that going to cost? And those people who may be sitting there demanding that you open the pool may suddenly learn that opening the pool is going to cost an extra $3, $4, $5, $6,000 a month. And that's going to require a special assessment in order to cover those costs. They may then say, okay, let's keep the pool closed for right now. And that's something to evaluate. So can we open, should we open, and how do we open? And how do we open is where you get to, do we have to remove pool furniture? Do we have slots where people maybe have a reservation system to get into it, you know, the pool facility? Do we limit the amount of time that people can stay in? If you're limiting time, who's going to enforce that? And we're not even getting to facilities like gyms. I think Fred mentioned parks, or maybe Dirk, I'm not sure. Parks and trails can be open, but none of us have mentioned reopening gyms.
Yeah.
So there's other facilities, and basketball courts. Tennis courts in the city of Irvine are open, singles play. Pickleball courts are open for singles play. I think most places nowadays now. But basketball courts, I haven't seen anything. I don't know, Fred and Dirk, if you've seen anything about basketball courts. I have not. Gyms are not open. So that's not even, so that's the next phase of where we're going to on some of these.
Robert, I also think you need to comment in terms of clubhouse facilities and related to gatherings of homeowner gatherings.
And that's an excellent point. So that's the same issue, right? How are we going to allow facility usage? Because you may need to amend your rules. If you're going to allow people to use the facilities, how many people are you going to allow to be in the facility? Most of the guidances, and again, always start by looking at the guidance issued by your county. Their goal really is to prevent gatherings. They talk about you know, having rules. I think the Orange County rule specifically says not allowing people that are not from the same household to swim within 6 feet of each other. So clubhouses, you need to really say, are we going to allow people that are not from the same household to use the clubhouse? I think for right now, I don't think we're near ready to have that discussion. But those are the things you're going to have to start looking at. How many people are going to use it? Who's going to be responsible for cleaning? What is that cleaning going to be? What's that disinfection plan going to entail? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to come in after people have used the facility and do that deep clean that you may need to have? And then that leads into, if you're using the clubhouse, do you have an obligation to disclose it if somebody who has used the clubhouse later comes and tells you, hey, I tested positive for COVID-19. And that's a whole other discussion. So, I mean, we probably need a whole other 2 hours for the three of us to really go into those issues beyond where we are now. But I think clubhouses, you have to do the same evaluation. Can you, should you, and how do we? I don't think we're ready yet because it's an enclosed space to do that. I haven't seen clubhouses, the demand for clubhouses yet. Some, yes, but not to the extent of pools. I got a demand saying you're violating my Fifth Amendment rights. It's an unlawful taking of my property. I'm like, no, it's not. But those are the level of discussions that we're having.
Okay, thank you so much. I so appreciate that. Your thoughts and guidance are greatly appreciated to all of you because what we're learning that our new normal has created situations that we need to strategically lead around. Having said that, what lessons have we learned through COVID-19 that could potentially enhance the leadership within our communities? In other words, what can or should we change to improve how we conduct business? What legal changes do we have to make to comply with our governing documents? I'll start off by Fred first. What are your thoughts?
So I think that most associations following this are going to have a protocol in place for dealing with these pandemic situations as they arise. I mean, we've been changing a lot of the association's rules and regulations and forms. We have to be prepared to close facilities, right? Because it's entirely possible that California will emerge in the coming weeks quite well and either see a summer or maybe even say a late fall peak. And we might have to be prepared to shut things back down or wind things back down for a reopening in the future. I know I have a lot of clients also that have started considering things like I have a client, for example, that has a series of bands come in and play, once a week throughout the summertime. And it's been really interesting because those contracts don't necessarily encounter situations where we close down. I mean, at most they contemplate things like inclement weather. So I think that our contracts need to consider this. I've had associations that routinely rent out their facilities for weddings. And most weddings, I had a nephew of mine that was supposed to be married in April. Most weddings have shut down since March. And, there were issues where people were trying to compel us to open the facility, even though it was closed, but then it turns out that nobody will come and cater it and play the bands to it. And so I think you're going to see rules to accommodate this. I think you're going to see us contemplating it more in our contracts over time, and maybe even budgeting for it a bit, because we haven't quite seen yet, because it's still so new, whether our collection on assessments are going to drop, right? Because there are a lot of folks who are unemployed right now, and we haven't seen that impact yet.
Okay, thank you so much. Dirk, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to actually divert off your question for 1 second, because I think there's one little summary that would be helpful for the now 141 people on this call as of a moment ago, which I think won't be controversial to Fred or Robert at this time, but I think just summing it all up, as far as the hierarchy of opening facilities, I think we're going to all agree the open space is fine. Something like a tot lot that's high touch is a little bit more risky. Pools are the really big push right now, because everybody's home with their kids. It's getting warm. We have Memorial Day. It's becoming summer. I agree. The clubhouses aren't. There's not a whole lot of push on them, and I think it's those enclosed spaces that are going to be closed for a while. I don't know, but our prediction is there's not a lot of push for them right now, with the exception of the workout rooms, the weightlifting rooms, which are actually quite risk laden according to the CDC rules. There's a lot of high touch as well as enclosed spaces, just like elevators, but elevators we don't have to open those up. So on the hierarchy, we're heading up this hill right now, and the outdoor spaces are getting the most play at this moment. As to what we can do, I see this, actually I can spin a positive, if we can, and a little tiny positive in the middle of all this, which is that I think with the comfort of using communication styles like this, the fact that we on an emergency basis had to transfer that over for our board of directors meetings, we're dealing with annual meetings by Zoom now, and we are de-emphasizing the need for the physical locations. That we're ahead of the law right now in many little corners of that, but it's the only way to get things done right now. And universally across the state, all the attorneys that do what we do have been doing exactly that. But I think the opportunity here in the next couple of years, it may not happen immediately in the next legislative cycle from what we've seen. First of all, we're largely on our way, as I'm sure Robert's going to get back to a little bit with respect to the CLAC at this point, California Legislative Action Committee. We're not there probably so much for this year, but in the future years, this is going to open up the opportunity for us to come into the 20th century. And maybe with respect to our meetings, maybe even with respect to document distribution electronically or through a website, and maybe even finally getting electronic voting for our annual elections that is blessed very openly and easily by our civil code. So I actually think in that respect, this is going to be a positive over the few years, and that's just me looking for that little nugget of positive.
Thank you so much. Jamie, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm going to piggyback off of what Dirk said. I know that really Keystone, as far as our investment in technology over the last couple of years, really allowed us to seamlessly transition to a telework environment to be able to support our clients. With an industry that's not been too technology forward, both legislatively and just in terms of expectation, I see that the governor and our legislator is going to start seeing some benefit to more technology and and getting rid of some of the paper that exists within our community. So I think communication, e-blasts, newsletters, keeping our members informed has been awesome. And then lastly, I think it's really taught our boards and our management team in terms of how to be more nimble. I think being nimble during this time, realizing, as Fred said, is, we may open today and there might be a spike tomorrow, and we need to make sure we're strategic with how we're going to close down just as quickly as how we're going to open up. I think having strategic leadership training to keep a very open mindset, so we're engaging with both sides of this very polarizing argument too, is also very, very crucial.
Thank you so much. And lastly, Robert, your thoughts?
Well, it's definitely an interesting time. I think Dirk said the other day, we're learning that it's easier to close pools or facilities than it is to reopen them. And that's definitely true. And we are going to see some changes, I think, coming out of this. Dirk mentioned the CLAC, which is the California Legislative Action Committee. We are working on, right now, we're all doing Zoom meetings. Understand that the Civil Code still requires the designation of a physical presence where homeowners can go and attend and listen to the meeting and somebody there to assist with that. So when we're not doing that, it is a technical violation of the Civil Code. The California Law Review Commission is already looking at that. We have been working with them on that for future legislation to eliminate that physical presence requirement. And I have been working with, and Jamie, you and I worked on this a little bit together, so some of you may have gotten an email about this, trying to get an executive order from the governor to eliminate the physical presence requirement in times of an emergency like this. He did that for the Brown Act. The Brown Act is the statute of legislation which requires cities to allow citizens to address the city council or any kind of governmental agency to be there to address that governing body. The Open Meeting Act and the Davis-Sterling Act mirrors that. He issued the executive order eliminating the physical presence requirement for under the Brown Act, but not under Davis-Sterling. We have talked to them about that. We're trying to get him to do that. We've been told at CLAC that is something that's on their radar for a possible future emergency order. Given where we are and that things are starting to open up, I'd be surprised if we actually get one from the governor right now. We are going to continue to work on that, especially every time we hear about a second wave and a potential shutdown, so that hopefully the next executive order, we are included in that. And you can imagine with everything that's on the governor's plate, homeowners associations don't really rank very high. The first response we got when I talked to Louis Brown, who's the CLAC advocate, was they asked him, well, why do you have to meet at all? So that just shows you the disconnect between where Sacramento is compared to us. In terms of amending our documents, I think we are going to see in the future, I am hopeful that we are going to be moving to a more digital world, more, as Jamie said, catching up with technology is today. Maybe eliminating that physical presence requirement. Keep in mind, you may have language in your bylaws which require a meeting at the principal place of business for the association or in the association. We may need to look at some of those documents to see if that language needs to be amended. If we are able to get electronic voting, and that is something that is on CLAC's radar, we're working on that, not for this year, but we were thinking for next year. With everything that's happened this year, everything's kind of off the table, so we don't know where that's going to be. But if we do get to electronic voting, depending on how the statute's written, we may need to update bylaws and CC&Rs, because some of those documents actually contain language in there that say the election shall be by double envelope secret ballot or by a secret written ballot. So is that electronic voting going to be a writing? I think it's going to depend on what the statute says as to how we interpret that, but that's something we're going to have to look at. And then the key is, right now, what I've been telling managers is you should be planning not only for reopening, but you just went through the shutdown. You should take this opportunity to say what worked well, what didn't work well, what could we have done better? Because, I get called and say, hey, Robert, should we shut down the pool? And I'll say, yes, shut down the pool. But I'm not the one who has to go and close it. The managers and the boards have to actually physically go and close it. And so, did we have to just flip a switch and turn off everybody's key fob? Did we have to run to Home Depot and buy a lock and a chain? What did you have to do? So start thinking about that. If we have to shut down, because there is a chance, it's a good time to really reflect on what worked and what didn't. Part of, I think, what has been the big issue has been communication with the homeowners. So how did you communicate with the homeowners? How did you tell them things were closed? How did you tell them what you were doing and what you were looking at? Did you do it all by email? And do you have everyone's emails? Should you go on a kind of a program or make an effort to try to get more emails for communication? Say, hey, we're going to communicate via email. Give us your email so we can send out email blasts. Or are we going to use Twitter or a Facebook page or whatever else? And there's a whole other discussion on some of those things. But take a look at that and see how are you going to do this next time. And some of that is not going to necessarily apply in a shutdown, but just we have a change. The guidance changed. We can now let everybody into the pool. We don't have to limit it anymore. How are you going to communicate that out? And what changes you're going to make in your rules? Okay. So I think that's kind of where we're going.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Robert. On behalf of the audience, thank you to our panelists for your time today. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Ellis, who will be coordinating the Q&A portion of the webinar.
All right, hello everybody. Okay, so we do still have some time here, so we can go ahead and fit in some questions. What I'm going to ask for most of you to do is if you can continue to remain muted at this time. If you do have a question, if you can utilize the hand raising feature to the right if you open up your participant window. Otherwise, if you can just type your question into the chat as well. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. It looks like we do have one question in the chat from Jean, and she's asking, is it feasible to have residents sign and acknowledge they assume the risk? Robert, how about you go ahead and take a stab at this one?
Is it feasible? Yes. Some communities are requiring them. I will say, I think that there's a double-edged sword to a waiver. I think it gives the board a false sense of security, and I think in order for a waiver to be enforceable, there has to be a bargain. They have to give something up, and we're not really giving something up, or they're not really giving something up if you're getting a waiver to use facilities that they have a right to use. And I think a good lawyer reality can argue the way around a waiver in this situation. So can you have a waiver? I think yes, you can. It's something, but it's not worth much more than the paper it's written on, is my opinion. Talk to your legal counsel for your specific community. Different lawyers have different thoughts on that, I think.
Okay, very good. We have another write-in question here. This is from Greg. Mandatory mask usage in gym, on pool deck, tot lots, when and if open. Fred, how about you?
So I like to put in my rules that you follow whatever the CDC current recommendations are. I think gyms are going to be phase 4. I think they're going to be pushed out pretty far. I think what you're seeing in the recommendations, I know Orange County Health has this, I think Riverside has this as well, is they want to see residents on the pool deck wearing masks when they are in areas where you cannot maintain the social distancing. And in fact, if you look in the CDC's rules, it says in there that we should make clear to residents that they should not swim with a mask on because it is difficult to breathe underwater when you have cloth across your face. And so I think associations are going to kind of to take that on a one-by-one. I can say this, I don't really want to be in the business of wrestling members down and forcing them to put masks on themselves. I think that you can deal with a lot of the issues about maintaining social distancing without specifically requiring masks and then leaving it to whatever the CDC's recommendations are at the time, which are changing almost daily.
Okay, very good. And let's have a question here for Dirk. Will the health department let us close the bathrooms at the pool?
You know, that's an interesting question because we're getting different answers in different places. I'll tell you this, in order to build a pool, you need to have bathrooms in order to have it authorized to be opened in new construction. And then closing, there's a couple of interesting things in closing the pools. We've had health departments come out and tell us that we can't chain the doors shut. We need to allow the push exit to remain in case somebody sneaks in and there needs to be an emergency exit. With respect to the bathrooms, initially it was thought that we would just open side gates and possibly have some a different system rather than some of the pools where you actually go in and out through the restrooms and they would just stay locked even if that was the case. But there have been a few health departments, Orange County Health Agency being one of them, that has given us some indications that they're not going to permit that. In fact, even in their model rules that they just issued, they were dated a little while ago, but they just came out this last week for when you can open pools. They're specifically referencing part of our disinfection plan has to include the interior of the restrooms, as well as, and separately, a regular check of the supplies as to paper towels, hand soap, and things of that sort. So they're signaling to us that they are going to be open, which is interesting because that's of a signal from a governmental agency. That's the first signal of something that truly is interior space that they're referencing as opening right now.
And Dirk, to kind of build down on that from the management perspective, as a practical measure with families, you're going to more than likely want your pools to remain open with small children if they're allowed.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing, if I can just jump in and just add something, a couple of weeks ago, Riverside County first said, okay, you can have your pool open, but you can only have a single swimmer in the pool. And they said you had to chain up the pool furniture and the showers had to be closed, but they did not close the bathroom.
Right.
So something to use that as a guide, so to speak.
Yeah. So they're following this. And so Orange County largely followed what the Riverside had done. By the way, that single swimmer has softened up at Riverside, which Robert knows. He just was telling the story from the beginning.
But and that's actually, you know, Dirk, that's a good point for us to make. All the comments we're making are only valid as of 5:55 tonight. By 6 o'clock, it could all be out the window. It is literally changing that quickly. I think it's slowed down a little bit, but it is very possible that tomorrow morning we're going to see something else, and everything we just talked about is different. So understand what we are talking about is as of right now.
Okay, very good. Robert, how about this question from Ingrid here? Is it permissible that the association inform its members of the number of active cases or deaths within the community?
That's actually a very interesting question. And, you know, a lot of attorneys are struggling with, hey, what do we say about COVID and you know, and privacy rights? What's interesting about COVID, it is not a private disease. In fact, when you are diagnosed with COVID, you're supposed to go back and figure out who you had contact with over the last 2 weeks and tell them, hey, I got diagnosed with COVID, you need to self-isolate. And in fact, doctors are actually supposed to, if they have the bandwidth, interview you and ask you who you've been in contact with, and they are supposed to call those people and notify them that you've been diagnosed with COVID-19 and that they should self-isolate. So given that reality as to what this is as an infectious disease, is it permissible to say, hey, we have this many number of people? I think, yes, it's permissible. I think you should talk to your own legal counsel as to whether you're going to disclose who that is. There are issues with that. I'm not going to get into the disclosing the identity of the individuals, but saying, hey, yes, we have 3 people in the community or 2 people that have disclosed to us that they have been diagnosed with COVID-19. I think you can ask them, hey, is it okay if we tell people? If they get it, if they tell you in writing, yes, it's okay. I don't really have an issue with it. Realize there is still a lot of good in people. And sometimes when people find out somebody has an illness, they may actually pitch in and help that person and build that sense of community. You never know. So I don't see any issues with notifying people, because there are a lot of communities that have common areas that are going to be shared, even when the facility is being closed. Think about not just high rises or communities where you have elevators and a lobby that's shared, and people may want to know we have somebody in the community that in the building that has COVID. But there are just even condos where you have just a simple stairway that goes up and splits off into multiple units. That handrail is shared. So letting people know, hey, we have it, it's here, I don't think is a bad thing.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Robert. Fred, we have a question here from George, but it's also similar to the one following by Jim Jordan here. So I'll go ahead and read Jim's question here because it does touch on what George would like to ask. We have beaches that we opened when Orange County opened their beaches. There are 2 pieces of play equipment in the beach park, a swing set and a slide. How should we handle the play equipment? Are the residents responsible to disinfect prior to use? And can you send us COVID sign language discussion? And then something about earlier there, I'm not sure what that means, but go ahead, Fred.
Sure. So, I mean, to be honest, in the governor's most recent order, not only did he call out public pools, but he called out playgrounds. And so I think in virtually every county, and I'm certain Orange County has, they've just parroted that language. So I think the play structures should remain closed, even though the balance of the beach could remain open. Now, what you do, I know a lot of associations have just simply taken the swings down with the intention that they'll put those back up as soon as they're able to use it. And they've either wrapped it with tape or put up signs that you can't use the play structures. I know if you're back behind a gate, that it's a little easier to control the access for who is in there. So, but I think that's that answer. And then as far as some proposed signage, we've actually shared some stuff, some documents with the folks at Keystone. So if you guys like to hit them up, we can share that, or if you'd like to follow up. We've sort of drafted it, because this is the trick. when you have signage and you have rules, it's just really tough to tailor them so that they really are one size fits all. So we've put together something of a model that a lot of associations can use. But like, I've had to deal with associations that have boat rentals and docks, right? Because they're around lakes. Or I've had, I've got an association with 21 swimming or 21 tennis courts and like 90 horse stalls, right? And so you end up having to kind of tailor the rules to meet your specific facilities and your specific needs. But it kind of starts off with disclaimer language. I was impressed with Disneyland as well. And so it should have something that warns of the risk and the impossibility of us eliminating it. And it should have some language in it that suggests that when a member uses the facility, it's at their own risk. And then I think you follow it up with some additional rules, the temporary rules that Dirk was saying that you talk and address.
All right, thank you, Fred. So we're kind of here at the end here. If everyone's okay, I might squeeze in 2 more questions. Are our panelists okay with that?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, looks like a resounding yes. And just to let everybody else know, if we don't get to your question, what you can do after this is completed, you can go ahead and email your question directly to your community manager. And our panelists have been nice enough to take and compile these questions and provide answers out that we can send out to a lot of you. So don't worry if your question doesn't get answered. We'll make sure that in the end, those questions you have are addressed. So let's go ahead and start off here. Dirk, I have a question here from Elaine. You stated that discussion on rules could be held in executive session. As much as I would love to hold discussion in executive, what would give us the ability to do so under restrictions in Civil Code 4935?
4935 says that we can adjourn into an executive session for formation of contract issues, personnel issues, and goes on to a few different things there with a member being invited. One of the things that it discusses is litigation. And I think in the ordinary course that a corporation such as a community association can't have some of the liability and potential liability discussions that it needs to have in the open session. So I believe it's perfectly acceptable to work on an evaluation of potential liability with respect to some of the adoption of some of these rules. I think to do otherwise would be a discussion by the board of directors who control the association as to exactly the means that some people who might be listening to the open meeting could come to the association with claims, and I don't think that is required by law. So that has been my position. I think it's the position of most attorneys in the state who do what we do. I've yet to see that challenged.
And Dirk, just to kind of build on that, you're also recommending that they're actually adopted during general session, correct?
Absolutely.
So there's
Absolutely.
transparency in that process.
Yeah, I think during the time that there's the discussion in the executive session is related to the relative liability issues and how we address the liability and potential liability issues. There are separate communications going on all through this process with the membership, letting them know that the board of directors is actively dealing with this. But certainly the evaluation of the rules and the adoption of the rules, whether they're emergency rules or whether they're fully adopted permanent rules at the time, would be done in an open meeting after the commentary of the board member, of the residents.
Can I add just something that's to help support Dirk's answer in that? Hopefully you're running these emergency rules through by your legal counsel, and any discussions you had over those rules with legal counsel, I think, is clearly would be permissible in executive session to protect that privilege.
Right. And I'll dovetail on Robert now. We can just tag team back and forth. I'd say even if the attorney isn't there, but you're reviewing the attorney's commentary on them, that should not be done in open meeting.
Agree.
Okay, good points there. So I'm going to now combine these next 2 questions here because they do relate. So what would be the liability for staff cleaning the bathrooms? And should there be any considerations for testing of on-site staff or others if at some time testing becomes a practical and quick process? Robert, how about you take this one?
Ooh, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's coming out on going back to work. And I think that's really where we need to look at in terms of the guidelines for going back to work. First of all, if your on-site staff is an employee of the association versus an employee of Keystone or your management company, there's a different discussion, I think. If it's the association's employee, then you have the responsibilities of the employer, and you have to, as a board, make the decisions as to what are we going to do for our employee in terms of, are we going to do temperature? Are we going to take their temperature when they come in? Are we going to require them to report if they've had a fever or any aches and pains, how they're feeling? There's all kinds of things that are coming out. I'm reading them every day for the firm, as to what do you have to do when you bring people back to work. If the onsite is an employee of the management company, then I think it's really on the management company to say, okay, under what conditions are we going to allow our managers to go back to work, and in what conditions? And that may be a discussion that they have with your board. I mean, if you have an onsite office, how are you going to reopen is going to be a discussion that you're going to have together. Are you going to open up the onsite office, or are you going to require appointments and do everything you can electronically via email, and only allow people into the office if there's no other alternative, like you have to give them a key fob or something like that? Testing is a difficult question, because that now gets into the area of people's privacy. Am I going to strap somebody down and force the swab? Because I think the test is you actually go up the nose. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to require that. So I think that's a discussion to have with your manager and with management as to what are the conditions on which you're going to reopen the on-site staff.
And then as far as from the Keystone perspective related to management, we actually have a COVID-19 task force that we meet with many times during the week to assess our standards and guidelines to make sure that we're consistent with CDC guidelines, and we're informing our managers as far as the precautions that they have to take, and we're doing that very proactively on our management side. So you'll hear things from your managers in terms of, wanting to hold meetings and so forth with gatherings, and so we're doing a lot of education to the management side as far as making sure that they're guiding their boards appropriately.
May I tag on to something that's a little different than the last question, but it's something pretty timely right now, which gets back to testing, people on site working with the sanitation issue, is very commonly in the discussion of boards of directors that don't have regular staff on site. As they're discussing the cost of somebody there to monitor the restrooms, to sanitize the handles and things of that sort, it is very, very often the question comes up, or the idea comes up of, well, we're involving in some of these owners in self-policing and wiping the knobs themselves as they come in and out. So as long as we have to have an identified person, can't we just take community volunteers to come in and every 2 hours wipe down all of these things for us if they agree to do that? And I'm going to caution all of you that it sounds like a great idea. It sounds like a way to have people participate, but big red flags have flown up from all the insurance carriers on this issue and the potential liability. Evaluate the potential liability very closely, because you're implicating all sorts of different bodies of law. They can be considered your employee. You may not have any insurance coverage for any injury they sustain, meaning catching COVID or other injuries. So be very cautious about that.
Okay, thank you. And this is going to be the last question of the night, and I'll throw this one over to Fred, and if anyone wants to tag in, they are more than welcome to do so. Can we refuse to open based on liability, risk, insurance cost until there is a clear statement that the risk has diminished or passed?
So you can. I think your issue is going to be more political than legal. So you'll face mounting pressure from the membership, and there's not necessarily less liability associated with remaining closed far longer than there is with opening. I mean, here we're talking about the risk of the illness coming to other people, but we're facing members that are lawyering up on both sides of this debate. Folks that are saying that their rights are being violated because they're being required to pay dues and they're not getting any of the benefits of membership. Often that attack comes voiced in this manner, that as a fiduciary, you have an obligation to run these facilities, and by keeping them closed longer than you need to, you're not. We're in an environment right now where I think, at least as to pools, right, because that's the sensitive point again, there's very strong governmental authority out there that association pools are public pools and they need to remain closed. But I think you're going to see health agencies have already gotten ahead of the issue. And they've said, this is how we want you to open it once you open it. But I think you're going to see as the governor heads into phase 3 that the issue of pools being open, I think that's likely when there's going to be the green light to open. My guess is that the stage 2 information, which is what we're relying upon, the public pools are closed, is just simply going to be gone because it's the old stuff. And I half expect that phase 3 is not going to say anything specific about pools, whether they open or whether they don't. But I think that's when you're going to see the harder decision on that being made. I do think that facilities, interior facilities, I agree with Robert on this, interior facilities, gyms and playgrounds, I think those are clearly going to be phase 4 items. And I think that's the state of where we are.
But just to reiterate what Fred said before, is build your plan now, because we ultimately don't get forewarning before we transition stages. So the second that transitions to stage 3, your members are going to be at the gates.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So plan, build your foundation now so you're prepared to open when you feel comfortable.
I could not agree more.
They're already at the gate, Jamie.
Yeah.
Yes, they are.
They've already blown down a few gates, but for the moment, it's been quiet.
Okay, very good. Well, everybody, that's the end of our Q&A session there. And on behalf of myself, Jamie, Teresa, Robert, Fred, Dirk, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We hope that this webinar has been informative and has equipped you with the knowledge that you need to move forward in this process. We appreciate all of you and the service that you provided to your communities. It's great, this volunteer work that you guys do, and that you want to ensure that you're putting your communities really in the best position. Now, again, as I said earlier, if you guys do have any questions, still feel free to email your manager. They'll send it up to our panelists here, and they'll be happy to give you guys the answers you're looking for. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a pleasant evening.